Thanks to the quick-wittedness of our business manager, who spotted through his keen sight a niche in the marketplace and due, in some part at least, to some demand, I am pleased to announce the formation of a brand new religion. It's going to be called the Church of No Change. And all you have to do is faithfully pay your dues. And no, you heard me right, no change is expected on your part, nor required. We will be pursuing a certain God whose, I'll go ahead and tell you, whose response when his followers ask about, what sort of changes or alterations, what should they do about their own present behavior. And of course it is burned indelibly forever in the hearts of the truly faithful. The only three words he has ever spoken to the followers when asked about this, he said, forget it. So at any rate, I knew you'd be proud to hear it, that you heard it here first. The Church of No Change and the God of, forget it. But now on to something a little more on the light side. An expanded survey of that general acreage that we had been tramping about, normally referred to as the absolute need for uncertainty in man's secondary world. And sort of three general headings, and I already let Kyroots throw them out into the ball field of your mental activity. And that is that only the unnecessary is criticized, only the uncertain must be defended, and sub 2, only the secondary world must be justified. And the big number 3 of the duo was that it's only man who justifies and defends non-tangibles, and it is man alone who creates the non-tangibles. All right, we'll start at the obvious place with number 3. First, only the unnecessary is criticized. Although we hit this sort of obliquely in a slightly different verbal way, anyone can realize that taking upon your own observation the kind of operational descriptions we were using of the primary, basic, absolutely required, silent world of man, and in the secondary, vocal, intellectual, always changing, always moving, secondary world, that when it comes to the former, the primary world, there is no such thing as any sane criticism directed toward it. There's simply not. Now, if you didn't think about it as piercingly as I'm sure all of you can by now, and you heard some of this and just thought about it in a slightly passing manner, you might think, well, that's not true. People are continually criticizing every aspect of life itself, every aspect of each other's life. People are just always bitching and whining and complaining. That's true. But there is no bitching, whining, complaining about the primary world. In fact, when it does happen, people, just by the ordinary man in the street, such people are immediately suspect, to say the least. They are shunned like a man carrying strange overripe vegetables in his underwear. Well, need I go on and point out the insanity, the unacceptable mainstream of reality, just think about it. Do you, at the ordinary level, does anyone that passes for sane, do they actually directly ever criticize the primary world? But of course, it's always an operational point of fact. The secondary and the primary world are so intertwined. The old man and the kid, the king and the kingdom, the ruler and the ruled, the guy dancing forward and the guy dancing backwards. That is, all of the human reflections of the polar-based energy that runs the three-dimensional world, they are so, may I be understating, so intertwined that the mind does not have any occasion, nor is it intended to, make any distinction. And so if I said only the unnecessary is ever criticized by the sane, remember, we're not talking about the anomalies of life vis-a-vis individual men. If I said that, and I said nothing in the primary world as we're calling it, and if an ordinary intelligence, all right, I know what you mean by primary world. And I said, there is no sane criticism ever directed there too. It might just go, well, that's nothing worth thinking about, because people are continually complaining about things that go right to the heart of human life, human existence. And it's not true. Not as I am sure that all of you can do for the sake of your own investigation, that you can picture a distinct division between the primary and the secondary, although it does not exist. But what else is new? But you can see it. And there is no such animal, there is no such entity, there is no activity that in any way would pass for sane criticism of the primary world. It would, de facto, it would by its own definition, be insane should someone criticize, because you'd get down, I was trying, with no great success, obviously, to refrain from pointing it out, but what kind of sane criticism would it be coming from any source to attack eating? And again, I'll assume that all of you are sharp enough that you're not going to fall into someone saying, well, you're overeating. That's not eating. What sane criticism can there be? What it amounts to is for staying alive, except for someone running a suicidal camp, or someone who wants you to join them and run the holes in the car and have somebody sit there with them while you whistle your way to heaven. To critique in any way the primary world is simply to find fault with being alive. That's all it is. And that is not sane. It is self-defeating. That would be the kind of ultimate illegitimate hobby that life would punish you for. Much worse from that kind of view than drinking and having to pay for it with a hangover. There is no such thing. Simply see it for your own reason. It's useful. It's not a theory. There is no such thing as sane criticism of the primary world. And the primary world, by its own definition also, or by our definition, is necessary. Because you may, I know it's hard to picture, but you might be able to survive without a CD player or an automobile, but you cannot survive. Let's see. You going ahead and do it? Oh, you can't survive without eating. I had it written down, the other stuff. Well, and humanity can't survive without doing the wild thing, dancing in the sheets. And people cannot survive if they go out and they stand in the midst of a torrential rain for probably more than 2 weeks straight, or if they jump feet first into a live volcano, that sort of thing. The primary world is primary. It is basic. And so it is never criticized. But due to the seamless growing of the secondary world from the primary, having no choice, that is the garden, and the flowers that bloom, the secondary world, grow there. They cannot be transplanted. They can't go anywhere else. They cannot suddenly spring up out of the forehead of David Brinkley, who some say is Zeus reincarnated. I'm just passing. I don't know. Was it him or Paul Rubens? Obviously, there's something springing from somebody. It is only, here's the point, back to number 3 where we started. It is only the unnecessary that's criticized. Once something Now let's press on now. We've already distinguished between the primary world being not open to criticism of its very nature, but now also consider once something has become stable and certain, which the primary world was before man even had the secondary, it had to be certain and stable. But then a real quick little shift that we can't stay on long because I know everyone's feet would get very hot. But then even in the secondary world there's a variation of this, because then once things become stable and certain, they become immune to criticism. If I was listening as hard as I thought, said somebody, then I would think within one sentence you reversed yourself at last count 5 times in one sentence, which must hold some kind of record. Ah! See, the secondary world is run on uncertainty and is therefore subject to, must have continual criticism, because the secondary world from a primary view is unnecessary. But then in the secondary world, once something has become at that level, relatively speaking, once it has become a kind of necessary, once it is stabilized, then it's immune. Was that 5 or 6 times? All right. If you thought that was, what do you think that was? Then how about this? How about a 4-step numerical neural gangbusters? Or maybe we should make it alphabetical, since so many of you have trouble when I start trying to do things by the numbers and talk about, you know, the first step and then the second step. And some of you, I know, I can look on your faces, I don't know what it is. You must have slept through algebra. So maybe we should go to letters and just go through the alphabet. So we'll start off, instead of the 4 numerical neural steps of gangbusters, let's go through the alphabet, because I'm sure all of you know that. We don't have to worry about, 1, 2, and 3 and counting. So we'll just do the, start off the alphabet and do it by letters. All right. C. It doesn't mean anything, but I guess there is some small danger of doing such as this, and people who are not familiar with it, or maybe people who are, going, it's finally it's reached the point that either this kind of stuff or me one has completely gone bonkers. Oh, all right. 1, 2, 3, and ABC. Are you happy? You're going to take all the fun out. All right, back to where we were. And I was pointing out that only the unnecessary is criticized, and that there is no such thing as sane criticism directed toward the primary basic world, and also that the basic world, one reason, if you didn't catch that little connection, I'll back up that much, that one way to describe why the primary world is not subject to criticism and is immune to it is because it is no longer uncertain, if it ever was. But let's assume at one time it was uncertain. Well, once it's stabilized, which it had to do, and had to become certain, or else man's mind, the secondary world, would not have commenced to germinate and grow. So at one time, let's just say, for the sake of saying this, because it's not invalid, that at one time the primary world was uncertain. Let us say, if you want to take good old comic book ideas of evolution, back when all of our grandparents were toad frogs. If that was the primary world, then there was a certain kind of uncertainty. Okay? But once it's stabilized, and man's little brainstem got to the point and went, hey, I don't want to be no toady frog. I want to be an accountant. I want to be a politician. Then the primary world became stabilized and certain, no longer uncertain. There is no uncertainty unless it's anomalous. If you're an average, healthy person, then your primary world, there is no uncertainty. Your heart does not get up every morning and go, let's see, what is it I'm supposed to do? Do I help sterilize the hormones? Am I in charge of breathing? There is no uncertainty if you're sane. So the primary world, on a wide level and on an individual level, is now stabilized. And it is immune. Nobody even thinks about it to be insanity, but it is immune to criticism. There is no sane criticism to make, unless you're an idiot, unless you're insane. And then all the criticism amounts to this of, hey, let's play suicide. That's the only possible thing you can say about any criticism of the primary world. So it's immune. And the little subtle stuff I backed up to see, perhaps I didn't link it together enough, is then even there's a version of this occurring in the secondary world, even though it is based on uncertainty. Continually. It's alive only on the basis of breathing and pumping the blood of uncertainty, that even at this level, some of the past uncertainties do become certain. They become stabilized. And once they do, they become immune to criticism. Mostly for a real nice little reason, I'll go ahead and point out. People ignore it. They forget about it. Now, how long has it been since you, or humanity, criticized the fact that 2 and 2 is 4 and nothing else? I mean, you would think 2 and 2 was 4 in Hypotheses' time. He was a friend of Euclid. 2 and 2 was 4 then. Wouldn't you think that by now we've had what? 2,500 years and we could do better than that? 2 and 2 by now would at least be 5. Jesus, right? Nobody thinks about it. Is there any sane way to criticize the fact that 2 and 2 is 4? Anybody's ordinary sidewalk mind will say, certainly not, that is ridiculous. I rest my case. Well, we drank part of it, but what's left, I rested. So even in the secondary world, once things become certain, they then become, in a sense, immune to criticism. In the same way that no sane source would criticize the fact that men must eat to live. In the secondary world, the version of it is once things become things that were uncertain, because everything in the secondary world, when that little seed first begins to germinate and the first signs of a plant come out of the primary world, some new idea, when it first comes up, it's uncertain. Where the hell am I? What's that big old thing going chirp, chirp, and looking at me? There is an uncertainty, but once it becomes certain, in a relative sense, it becomes immune to criticism because it's no longer uncertain. And only the uncertain, only the unnecessary, that's getting ahead of yourself, is criticized. But now back to the 4. To really help clear this up, I was going to give you the 4 gangbusters. Well, when I first thought about it, I tell you the truth, I went ahead and stalled here for a while. I was hoping that you and I would forget about it and I wouldn't pull this. Can't be any worse, right? Or was that a Kyroot? All right, try these 4 steps. Still under the heading of only the unnecessary is criticized. Getting old is a primary necessity. It is a primary certainty. Young toughs out there on the street don't bother, in a real sense, to hassle the elderly. Because in this kind of sense, they no longer have anything to prove at the primary level toward the elderly. I'll do your metaphors for you, but they don't mean anything. An average person, average male in the city, ages 16, 20, 25 maybe, even longer, running down the street. You mean up here? No, the man's running down the street. Jesus, everything is not a metaphor. And jogging down the street, and there's a gang of hooligans, an uncertainty, running in a new neighborhood. They're obviously, you can tell by the way they're standing. You can listen to the noise down there. You can hear what's going on, and you know, if you're not elderly, you're still a kid, you know that there's every chance in the world you're going to get down there, and there's going to be trouble. Okay. And you're right, very likely, if you think that. But take that same person. You mean metaphorically? A man gets, the same guy now is 60 years old. And he's jogging along and everything else equal. We move the time frame. We play anachronistic games And here he is back at the same place, same guys, but he's 60. He doesn't even think about it. But you know what? Since all dance floors, except those who sink, are peopled by two dancers. Polarized energy has two poles. Not only does he not think about it, he's almost invisible. The young hooligans, the toughs, this uncertain environment, they don't even pay attention. The guy jogs by. If we went back 20 years, 40 years into the past, and he jogged by, they go, Jesus Christ, man, why don't you lose some weight? Where'd you get those purple shoes? Hey, those kind of running shorts, keep them, keep them. They may come back in style. What are you, running in the hairdresser's foot race or something? Dressed the same way, same thing, except he's now 60. He runs by, they don't say anything. You jump out of your neural hiding place to these young, untrustworthy, dangerous, potentially dangerous hooligans, and you say, I want to ask you a question about that old guy that just run by, that guy that just run by. And they'd go, what guy? You understand? He didn't even think about him. And they didn't even see him. The young toughs, the kids, only have something to prove when becoming old, when becoming certain. It's not just a primary affair. Because when the young toughs, the irresponsible kind of people hanging around the street corner, when they're going to attack the elderly, it is only when the elderly have become certain. You're not talking about jogging anymore, are you? All right, how about C? That all ordinary ideas, which is all aspects of the secondary world, eventually get old. That is, they become certain and brittle. And when they reach that point, they can run by and the kids don't even notice. The kids not only do not criticize, but once they reach a sufficient age, once they have ripened to the point that they're no longer uncertain at all. Whew. I trust all of you can run 3 feet, because we're talking about metaphors, non-metaphors, and then something else that's somewhere else. The first picture I gave you is literally true. You'll find out, those of you who don't know, but you should be able to hear the validity of it. There becomes a certain gap between generations, between an individual that at the age of 20 ran through a certain neighborhood, ran through a certain corner, to a certain type of guys more or less his peers, which of course is what I mean by ruffians and hooligans, troublemakers. And he's in for it. Whether he physically gets attacked or not, he is going to suffer the SHs, the supreme hassles, when he goes by. And all he's got to do is just show any interest, and it's going to be Fifth City. And take the same circumstance, absolutely the same, and make this guy 60 years old. And of course, we're not talking strictly on the primary level, and run him through there, and he won't even think about it. Well, first off, you understand, I'm saying there will be no trouble, no confrontation, because you're going to look at one way, he doesn't even think about it. He doesn't even see them. He just runs past. If they're standing in the street in his way, not like when he was 20, that he might be tempted when he sees them, that am I going to bump into that guy? Am I going to make him move? Or am I going to run off the sidewalk? Should I even stop? Jesus, there's 17 of them standing there. Rather than that, now we move him to 60. We're talking about primary certainty, primary aging. He just runs, he doesn't even think about it. If they're in the way, who knows what he's going to do? Chances are he's just going to run off the sidewalk. But when he runs off the sidewalk and around them, it's not the same as when he was 20, that he may run around it and then suffer even more uncertainties about, Jesus, that make me look like a bigger fig than I am? Should I go back? Should I have run into him? Should I have taken that Charles Atlas weight course when I was younger so I could whip 17 people's ass? The old man, when he gets to be 60, primary age, primary certainty, he just runs around them. Not just them, but anything. But he just runs around them. So there is no confrontation, there is no hassle happens. What I was going to say is, one, if you want to look at from both dancers' view, because it's him and always I, not I, dancing together. In this case, this old man, the 60-year-old man, and these 17-year-old hooligans. If they're in the street in his way, he simply runs around them. And he doesn't think about, I made an ass of myself. It's no more than if there was a dog in the street on the sidewalk. He just ran around it. So one is, he didn't notice, and two is, they didn't notice. That if you ask him, Hey, did you see that guy? He got dangerously close. He almost ran into some of you guys. He looks like the kind of guy that I'm surprised I just saw him. And he had that kind of look. He's the kind of guy I'm surprised he can go by and give you a push. And they'd go, what guy? He almost does not exist. He is almost invisible. Forget friggin' joggers and people on the street corner. We're talking about neural operations. The older it gets up here, that in the secondary world it goes through its own variation of primary aging. And the way you think, your mental operations become an older and older jogger, and if there's any new ideas that in some way seeped into some corner in your place, the two never meet. The old one just ignores them. It doesn't mean anything. You get old enough, your thinking becomes certain. You become now a 60-year-old man or woman up here, and some new ideas get into a street corner. You just accidentally turn on a program or pick up a book, and it's some absolutely new idea to you. Is that going to bother you? You're going to wrestle with it or work? No, hell, you run off the curb and go around it. And then if we could, in a sense, grab the ideas, some potential in your own nervous system that might have gone, hey, I read that, I never thought about that. And for a minute I thought, Jesus, if that's true, I've wasted my whole life, to make it melodramatic. But, if that's true, I'm going to have to go back and unrun 60 years worth of mental jogging. And it's like the young hooligans go, wow. And then to put it in very crude words, it sounds psychological, which all of you know it's not. But then it's almost as though the old man goes, what if that's true? As excited as I almost felt for a moment. Great God Almighty, smelly armpits, I'm 60 years old. What's the sense? I can't go back and undo all this. Even if a man seems to sort of get a flash of temporary epiphany and goes, it's true, everything I know could be wrong. These young ruffians out there on the street, these new ideas could be right, or at least have a lot of validity. But my God, I'm 60 years old. I got varicose veins of the brain. I'm tired. Let them, I ain't got time to worry about it. The old man can run past the street corner full of new ideas. Now, I don't mean better ideas. Ruffians, hooligans, unruly sorts. And just run around them. And if you tried to say, why don't you stay there and confront those ideas? Why don't you stay there and push them off the street, or at least stop, and eyeball them? Have a staring contest. The truth is, he'd be in about the same position as I said the hooligans would if you jumped in and asked them. If you said, why did you let them run you off the street? He'd go, who? Oh, don't give me that. There's a whole bunch of kids on the street corner back there, and you run off the street. You might go, oh, yeah. Well, what's the point? Well, why don't you stand up for yourself? When it becomes that close to a certainty, it's insanity, because certainty is not subject to criticism. You cannot grab an old man and say, hey, those kids back there were fooling around the sidewalk. They got in your way and made you right in the street. Is he going to take that as criticism? Just an ordinary 60-year-old man out running. That you jump out and say, you should be ashamed of yourself. Boy, you look like some kind of sissy. A 60-year-old guy out jogging, and you're saying those kids out there fooling around, they had no more respect for you. They're just troublemakers. And you had to step off the sidewalk. You could have got hit by a car. But if nothing else, they should show respect. If he's just an average 60-year-old brain, what's his attitude going to be to this kind of criticism? Oh, Jesus. Go away. All right, number 4. D. Of this quartet, as I was going to conclude this part, which is about going to do it all, and say that once your thinking has thusly aged, in the way I'm describing, as it should, as is normal, it is, just put simply, it is no longer subject to criticism. And all of you know by now, the interest, the usefulness is not out there. That, well, I'm to the point that nobody criticizes me. If somebody out there can criticize you, I don't know what the hell you're doing here anyway. You still don't know what's going on. But if your old thought, if what you are reaches the point, as it will, that ordinary people's thought becomes dustily aged, as I was describing by the jogger. Once it reaches that point, it is no longer subject to criticism. It is thus no longer subject to change, because it has become necessary. It has become necessary and normal, because none of this is in any way abnormal. It's not abnormal psychology. It's not abnormal athletic habits. But in every generation, in every human that's just ordinary and sane, it starts out in your secondary world is uncertain. That is the nature of the secondary world, and as long as it is growing in health, it remains uncertain. And regardless of what you're doing individually, in toto, the collective secondary mental world of man stays uncertain. But in any garden you look out and the garden looks, it's beautiful, it's blooming, but there's always a bunch of weeds dying down there. Little wilted flowers, little 60-year-old guys that their legs gave out. Little flowers, God bless them, but they're about to go live with Elvis. So that's there. That is normal. They're now no longer subject to criticism, because what they have become is necessary. And only the unnecessary is criticized. I could even point out, I know this strikes some of you at times as being abrupt, but the ultimate seriousness from a three-dimensional angle is death. And then I could say that the dead are not criticized. And if some of you are ordinary, you say, well, that's not true. People do criticize the dead. I know they do. But also remember something else I pointed out to you that's very common throughout this world, in the secondary world, is the laws of slander and libel. Is that society collectively will not recognize it as being offense to criticize the dead. You have no legal action anywhere in the civilized world that's fairly free, at any rate, to criticize. There is no legal action for you to slander and libel the dead. They're immune from it. And for one reason is, of course, they don't say it this way, one reason is, it is the ultimate uncertainty. So what's the sense in criticizing a dead person? That person is now as stable and as certain as they can become from a three-dimensional view. And nobody would look at it this way, but it's due to where we started, number one tonight, that only the unnecessary is criticized. And if you're alive in the secondary sense, then your life feeds on uncertainty. And the older you get, the less uncertain you are. The more you become apparently stable. You become old. You become aged. You become, of course in the city they like to call it wise, settled. You become old and brittle. You become less and less uncertain. You become more and more certain, and you become less and less subject to any criticism. And the ultimate being, once you lay down and begin to smell like that guy that you mentioned that perhaps had rotted edibles in his undies, no one criticizes you. Collectively speaking, society does not recognize that the dead, the ultimately certain, is what they are. From a three-dimensional view, those who have become ultimately, they are the living example, so to speak, of certainty. And they are not subject to any sane criticism. Society collectively, the collective thoughts of man, does not recognize, it's just nothing. They just do not recognize any legitimate criticism of the dead, that is, of the certain. We'll pick it up again next time. How was that for an ending? And don't forget, our new church will have our Wednesday night meeting Thursday, and we'll have bingo shortly thereafter.